Good afternoon, everybody. Happy Friday. Welcome to the Pink and Preview Show. Joining you on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. Been a while since we've done one of these, Pad. I was trying to think the last time, but I think with holidays and various game cycles and certain managerial decisions, I think it's thrown everything up in the air a little bit. But of course, if you've got any questions to put to myself or Paddy over the next sort of half an hour or so, be it on the game, be it on the AGM last night, be it on the new badge news that we've had this week, we've got plenty to get through. It's never dull, is it, Pad? A week following Norwich City?
Definitely not the minute, Connor. No, definitely not dull. Feels like a lifetime since Brentford, but it's reality. Is it 3 weeks? Yeah, and in that time, where do we start? Managerial change, 6 points. If you start the timeline before kick-off at Brentford, and a whole different positivity around the place. And I think as much as we all can see by looking at their results, Wolves are probably a step up from Southampton, 6th in the table. Really look like they've got something going there now. 1 defeat in the last 7, 5 wins in 7. I think Dean Smith said this morning. But for me, still, it'll be hugely a positive atmosphere at Carrow Road at kickoff. And, I didn't think we'd be getting there when we were in the depths of Leeds, for example, or Watford earlier in the season. So plenty of points, plenty of games left, as Dean Smith keeps saying. So I can't wait. Tomorrow, 3:00's been looking forward to games rather than maybe fearing what could happen, and that's always a good place to be.
Yeah, we'll get into Dean Smith's press conference, which he did at 9:00 this morning. That's a slight change for us. Press has moved from they were usually about lunchtime, weren't they? And they've now gone to kind of 9:00 on a Friday morning, which Dean Smith prefers and fits in with his schedule. So probably works a lot better for us as well to say that. But I'm sure that's not why he's done it. But yeah, it's hopefully we're going to get back to in-person ones pretty soon, all being well. Hopefully, of course, depending on the situation in the rest of the country. Let's start then, Pad, with the AGM yesterday, but more specifically the news around Mr. Stuart Webber. I mean, we've been reporting it for a while that this new contract was coming. I think it was probably a fairly open secret before he revealed it last night. And it's not signed, sealed.
Not to all, sorry, Connor, not to all media, and we'll leave that one there. I'm sure you know who we're referring to.
This is true. Yes, absolutely, that is true. It's not completely signed, sealed, and delivered. I don't think any pen's been put on paper, but certainly agreed in principle and by all accounts done, just not signed. A big step, isn't it, for Norwich City, given the body of work that man has produced in 4 and a bit years that he's been at the club.
Yeah, it's clarity and it's certainty, and following on from that, Dean Smith, when he was asked about that situation today and Stuart's public declaration, essentially what was already known internally, he basically said that at his interview, which was clearly conducted by Stuart and Neil Adams, he wanted to know about Stuart Webber's future. And it's obvious, why wouldn't you? The guy who's interviewing you, if he was going out the door, hypothetically, at the end of this season, then if you're Dean Smith, you're probably looking at it and thinking, well, it could all change again in the summer. So he said it was important that he had that clarity. And despite how it obviously ended, what you're talking about there, Connor, is a body of work that's been achieved, really founded on a very, very good working relationship between head coach and sporting director. That was the model that they put in place. Quite progressive, quite innovative for English football, certainly at the level Norwich were operating at in 2017. And now we've got to a point where a managerial / coaching cycle has come to pass, but I don't think you could dispute that Norwich, on every measure, league status, what they've achieved on the pitch, what they've achieved off the pitch, how they've weathered financially a pandemic that nobody could have foreseen coming, the work infrastructurally at Colney and more that they'd like to do at Carrow Road, which again was touched on with safe standing and developing the city stand at the AGM on Thursday night. All of those things have developed and continue to evolve from a structure put in place by Stuart Webber. He was appointed to roll this out, this cultural change, this infrastructural change, this complete different way of Norwich have operated previously on and off the pitch. And the fact that the chief architect, if we want to call him that, is going to hang around. And I know there's a lot of debate. I think you were responding to one or two on Twitter about what does a rolling contract mean in terms of certainty. Maybe you want to dive in there. I've been spoken to Zoe Ward about that after the AGM last night. But there's no doubt it certainly does provide the clarity and the reassurance to a Dean Smith or maybe to the board as well that he's here and he's staying here beyond 2022. And I think ultimately, all I would say on the rolling aspect is that is a trustful relationship between Webber and the owners. And ultimately, I just couldn't see a scenario where Stuart Webber would, at the drop of a hat, say, I'm off. I've got an opportunity wherever that may be. He said last night, it's going to be outside football. I thought that was very, very intriguing. That he's not going to jump into another football-related role. But I just don't see a scenario where he would literally say, see you, I'm off, and then leave them in the lurch. It would fly in the face of everything he's ever said about that relationship and what that means to him and the opportunity he feels those owners have given him. So I wouldn't be necessarily too concerned that it isn't a fixed point in time. I'm here for another 3 years or whatever. And look at it really just for what it is, which is clarity now moving forward. Whatever happens on the pitch now, rest of this season, come the summer, Dean Smith in the dugout, Stuart Webber in the sporting director chair. And I think that would give a lot of Norwich fans plenty of confidence that if it is not to be another season of Premier League football, that the club's well set up to have another crack at coming straight back.
Yeah, just to explain that rolling contract in a bit more detail, as Stuart Webber outlined it there, and you said, and he has always said, to be fair, that he wouldn't leave the club in a lurch. I would imagine conditions of that contract will be a pretty hefty notice period. If he was to decide to leave, you would imagine that would be fairly common practice. That will be renewed annually with the board. So, and it is, as Zoe Ward said, and I put the question that Alex has raised in the comments, which I'll read out. He said, "Is it really the best time to have a person who is supposed to be the long-term visionary in charge of the infinite game to be on a rolling contract?" Shows no commitment on his behalf to Zoe Webber last night, and she was keen to stress that actually this is probably just a reversion back to the contract that he initially joined the club on when he was on a rolling contract, and that's how the majority of employability contracts do tend to work. So it's probably brought him in line with probably a lot of the key staff at Norwich City, maybe with the exception of Dean Smith. But it certainly don't get the impression, and you mentioned the transparency there, the relationship, which is perfectly fine and well, by the way, despite what some reports have suggested in the last 24 hours. There's certainly a strong relationship, a strong understanding there. So I don't think Norwich City fans need to worry about Stuart Webber just one day picking up his things, clearing his desk and saying, right, that's me done, see you later. I think it will be a bit more pre-planned with that, and he's already said on record in the past that he'd like to be involved in kind of the succession plan as well. What that looks like, of course, we don't know. So that's Stuart. Then he's staying, rolling deal, renewed annually. They're the key points. As I said, there's a lot more on the AGM on pinken.com. You can also check out an interview with Zoe Ward on our YouTube page as well, which is pretty good. I put to her about points that were raised mainly at the AGM in terms of the ones that Paddy mentioned there, Stuart Webber's contract, external investment, and also the redevelopment of the city stand as well, which the wheels are beginning to move, albeit very slowly. Let's move to the other issue, Pad, then before we talk about the football, which is, of course, the new badge, which was released this week. I know. The fact we went through an AGM last night and it wasn't raised once is probably an indication of maybe how it's been received. We did a poll on our website. I think it got about 2,500 votes. It was pretty split, I think, amongst the four options we have, which I think was like it's all right, not bothered, and hate it. I think it was fairly spread, but the majority, I think, edged towards liking it. It's not. The club have said evolution, not revolution. That's certainly the case, isn't it? What are your thoughts on it? Give us your kind of take on the new badge, if you have any.
Well, not huge, nothing that would aerate me. No, I mean, ultimately, as everybody probably knows by now, the accent gives it away. I'm not a Norwich City fan from birth, so I'm going to throw that back to you. But all I would say is I can understand the drive to kind of modernise in terms of, it's all very kind of, for me, when I hear and digest things like this around a football club, it's all pretty peripheral. More sort of marketing and commercial maybe that will allow them to streamline and those sort of phrases they were coming out with. I mean, ultimately, it's retaining the same elements that have been on the badge forever and a day, and it just looks a cleaner, more modernised look, really, doesn't it? Ultimately, but for me, it smacked of something that's more of a commercial brand awareness type thing, rather than anything to get too upset about. But obviously, as I say, I'm not a Norwich fan, so I'm going to throw that one straight back to you, Connor. As a Norwich fan, maybe, rather than a journo, what was your take on it, the badge?
Obviously, I saw it in advance, probably a couple of months ago, and was a bit indifferent about it. Kind of that Alan Partridge gif where he just sort of shrugs his shoulders. Very, very much that. And then since sort of re-seeing it, I suppose, when it was obviously launched earlier this week, I actually thought, yeah, you know what, I think I quite like that. So maybe that's an indication that it's a bit of a grower, maybe. And I've seen some people say we can't really judge it until we see it on a shirt, until we see it in the stadium and on the flesh and all of that. But yeah, I think most people, when the club website broke down all the individual elements and why they wanted to change it, I think it does make sense, doesn't it? And like you say, probably brings the club in line with the rest of the Premier League clubs, all of which, bar 4, I think, including Norwich City, have renewed their or revamped their badge since the turn of the century. So yeah, probably overdue. 2-year project. It's been for them. There's also a new club font as well, if anyone's particularly interested in that, and some new. I think they call it Weave. It's again a very sort of type of pattern that they're going to use on their commercial activity. So this is about improving their digital brand more than anything else. I think that's it in terms of off-pitch matters. As I said, Pinkin.com, plenty more on the badge and on the AGM if you want to check that out. Let's go to Dean Smith and what he was talking about today in his press conference, Pad. It was trying to get used to the earlier press conferences, but also how concise and short they are. I think this one was about 30 minutes, which would be probably the shortest Daniel Farke press conference ever. So definitely a different approach in communication. What did you make of his comments first and foremost? Let's start with Todd Cantwell, because obviously that was something that a lot of people noted last weekend. Todd was obviously removed at half time. Josh Sargent came on, made a bit more of an impact. You were obviously at the game. I was on holiday off, so I didn't see as much of it. But in terms of, I thought it was quite interesting what he said about how he'd spoke to Todd and explained kind of his reasoning as well, and how Todd maybe came around to his line of thinking as well.
Yeah, I mean, so far, every touch point we've had with him, Dean Smith, this is, you ask him a question, he'll try and be as candid as he can in terms of the reply, and very, very candid there that, he didn't really have to put into the public domain that, they'd spoken. I don't think that was anything out of the ordinary. I'd imagine if you told Cantwell, I'm hypothesising here, but you probably would just have wanted, once you got past the game day 1, game 2, and things have, calmed down and you're back at Colney and you're doing your build up into Wolves, it's inevitable. If you're a player who's been removed at half time of a game, you'd like to know the reasons why. And Dean Smith was very, very honest and told him more or less what he told us all after the game on Saturday, that he didn't quite think he hit the levels that were required to operate in the Premier League. And with the caveat, and we all know the backstory there recently, that a guy who hasn't really trained a huge amount, certainly hadn't played a lot of Premier League football. I think that was his first involvement since the Watford game on September the 18th. So you kind of getting on for 2 months really, which is a huge chunk of time for anybody to be out of the Premier League environment and then come back in and be what you need to be. But as Dean Smith said himself, it was a risk, but it was a risk he felt was worth taking because he clearly is a fan of Todd Cantwell, the player, and there was more of that today in his considered response, that Todd needs to go away and work at certain things, and whether that's his fitness or the mental side of it, the physical side of it, but all the elements you need to bring the best out of Todd Cantwell, which is, as Dean Smith said, a player that he doesn't need to tell Norwich fans how good Todd Cantwell is. They've seen him. They've seen his development in the last 2 or 3 seasons. We all saw what he could do at this level 2 seasons ago, round about this point of that season. Todd Cantwell, in the right frame of mind, physically and mentally, is a huge asset to this Norwich squad. So if you're Dean Smith, you want to get him to that point. And that's what Dean Smith said, that him and Shakespeare now, as coaches, have to, on a daily basis, bring him on that journey to the point where he is, as Dean Smith said, a very, very, very good Premier League player. So I think it's, if you're Todd Cantwell, you want that candour, you want that honesty, that, right, okay, I know now under this guy that if I hit these levels that he's asking or demanding of me, there's a fair chance I will be in his 11 because he clearly rates me as a player. So if I'm Todd Cantwell, I'm going away. And Dean Smith said this morning he trained all week, no problems at all. So I was thinking about this a bit later on this morning after the presser. It's a really interesting dilemma now because he also went on to say that he had no other issues fitness-wise from the guys who were on duty last week. Do you now, if you're Dean Smith, go, I'll tell you what, I'll start with the 11 who finished that game because how good they were in that second half, which would mean obviously Josh Sargent starting on the right, Rashica on the left, Cantwell maybe on the bench? Or do you is it quite astute management to having took Todd out the firing line, but then spoken to him about what you want from him to go again? There you go. You're starting again tomorrow against Wolves, and let's see if you can kick on and take on board the things that I'm asking for. So for me personally, I'm very interested to see come 2:00 tomorrow whether Cantwell is in the 11 or if he's on the bench. But either way, there's no issues there at all. I think as Dean Smith said, Todd after the game in the dressing room was as happy as anybody, congratulating the players. I think I saw some pictures of him he was in that seat just behind the dugout, and you could see towards the end of the game pictures of him and Rashica, and they were urging them boys on. So absolutely no issues at all with a guy who ultimately, what this boils down to is he hadn't played any real football for 2 months. It was a big ask. It proved maybe beyond him against a very, very good Southampton team in that first half. We have to reiterate that. There might have been types of games where he could have been dropped in and could have started to look like the player we know, but that wasn't the case as the game unfolded. Dean Smith could see that, him and Shakespeare in real time, made the call, but no issues at all. Todd Cantwell, I think we all can agree, is an asset to this Norwich group of players, but he needs to be at the levels required to influence a Premier League game. And clearly, in that first half, we could see it with our own eyes. Dean Smith could see it. He wasn't at that level. So that's what I say. Interesting for me, team selection tomorrow, whether it's Cantwell in the 11 or Cantwell on the bench. But either way, big part to play under this head coach, no doubt about it.
And just to develop that a little bit further, to look at it from the Josh Sargent perspective as well, I suppose if you've got someone who's come off the bench and made a real impact, we all know that starting them in the next game, maybe then you realise you possibly lose that impact from the bench as well. So whether that's comes into Dean Smith's thinking is going to be an interesting one. I watched, as I'm sure many people did, just before Dean Smith was appointed, and it was clear that he was going to be the next Norwich City head coach. There's a very good podcast with him and Graham Hunter where he speaks about him before a match. If he drops players or leaves certain players out of the lineup, he will have a meeting with them and go through the reasons why perhaps he's leaving them on the bench or why he feels someone else is a bit better suited. He was obviously asked today about the comments that we had from John Terry in the week about his man management as well. He spoke, there were 2 words really that kept cropping up from him: consistency and belief. It feels like this is a pretty different approach from Daniel Farke, and naturally he's a different human being, but there seems a lot more focus on how he gets the best out of Norwich City's players as people, as well as players and entities on a football pitch.
He's followed on this week from what he said last week post his unveiling, that he is watching everything those players are now doing at the training ground, and not just with a ball at their feet, but how they carry themselves, their behaviours in and around the place. He's obviously quite a student of human behaviour, and also today we learned, in his phrase, he's a data geek as well. He talked about how much store he places by analysis and the sports science and the numbers around performance. And he quoted that figure that collectively that team of his last week ran 5K more than Southampton, and I think 0.5K of that high speed, intense running. Now, he also caveated that by saying that probably they had to do that because they didn't have as much of the ball as Southampton, and that's an area they need to be better at on the ball. But yeah, from what we're learning all the time, both in terms of with his Norwich hat on, and obviously, you're referencing stuff that he's done previously in the media. It's very clear that he's definitely not your old school type of manager. There's no 2 ways about that. He's very, very happy to embrace the stats and the big data element of it, but also, as John Terry revealed, the man management side and the human side and the personal side. And Dean Smith, when asked about that John Terry anecdote today, I thought it was quite interesting. He said that he'd spoken to JT this week and that he'd mentioned he'd done that media, and he just elaborated a little bit that at that point when John Terry was referring to that anecdote, he'd only just finished playing and was going into coaching at Villa under Dean Smith. And when you've been in the game as long as Dean Smith has, you understand how important it is to get inside the heads of these players, because not every player is different. We've just talked about Todd Cantwell there, and there'll be a way of handling Todd Cantwell that's probably different to, I don't know, hypothetically a more experienced player, maybe a Krul or a Hanley. And it's knowing what makes each individual player tick that is going to extract the maximum from those players. And that's, to me, maybe that is a slight nuanced difference with Daniel and how Daniel operated. I mean, Daniel was very much a kind of tough love on a lot of occasions, and certainly with his younger players as well. He would be very hard on them both publicly and behind closed doors. And maybe Dean Smith is, been around the block a little bit more and understands that, I think he said, I think there was a you need to give them the stick occasionally, but a lot more of it, certainly with the modern player, is the arm around the shoulder and trying to bring them with you rather than trying to force them down a path. So what we're learning each passing touch point we have with Dean Smith is that he's a very deep thinker on the game and also the individuals within that game. And it's certainly whatever he said, whatever he did at half time last Saturday, it certainly worked a treat. So good signs, I would say, in terms of how you manage a group to get the absolute best out of them, which you're going to have to do with Norwich, because we all know pound for pound how difficult it's going to be to compete with those other 19 clubs in the Premier League. So any of those marginal gains you can find, the better if you're Norwich.
That's exactly the word I was going to use, marginal gains. We hear Stuart Webber speak about it a lot from a kind of sporting director perspective, and extracting everything you can when perhaps you don't have the financial resource. I guess that translates onto the pitch as well, doesn't it? If you're a coach and you're in a Norwich City situation, and quite often you're playing against teams every week who do have a bit more resource and maybe a better quality on the pitch than you do. It is about extracting as much as you can. You referenced the data stuff. That was quite interesting, I thought, particularly on, as you said, the kilometres aspect of it, the running aspect of it. But there was also a little snippet on there how he said he felt the current Norwich City squad maybe wasn't used to engaging higher up the pitch, which is the change he made last weekend, or hunting the ball with as much intensity as perhaps he wants his teams to do. And maybe that there needs to be sort of some middle ground that needs to be found as well. So we talk about kind of what does a Dean Smith side look like. The reality is we're probably still working towards it, aren't we? This is obviously the first full week he's had. He said he's been able to maybe or drip feed, as he said, a bit more information into the players. It certainly seems like a Dean Smith Norwich City side is going to be one that presses a lot higher and engages opponents much higher up the pitch.
And it needed to happen, let's be honest, because a huge...
Well, they're not good enough, are they, Pad? They're not good enough to sit behind the ball and simply soak up pressure for extensive periods, as was proven in the first half last weekend.
Exactly. And it was telling. I thought that in that first half, they were not carrying out what Dean Smith or Craig Shakespeare wanted from them. And is that because of, inevitably, you can change your head coach, but it takes a lot longer for maybe those players to almost shed what's been programmed into them by, the previous individual who'd been there, 4 years. So that was kind of what we'd have expected if Daniel Farker had been in charge, to kind of sit and soak and then try and incrementally come out of the sort of the hole they dug themselves on the edge of their own 18-yard box. That's not how Dean Smith wants to set this Norwich team up, and was very clear on that at half-time, both in terms of the personnel change he made, but also the collective urgency that they showed in terms of to press a lot higher with more intensity and more athleticism. And for me, that so far is the biggest change. And I know it's only been 190 minutes, and we'll get a bit more evidence tomorrow. But what he said was earlier today that Wolves under Bruno, as opposed to Nuno, like to dominate the ball. So I'm thinking immediately, well, Southampton were very keen to dominate the ball last week, and they managed that very successfully in the first half. So I would think the pressing and the intensity will be one of the methods he'll be looking to counteract that if Wolves want to go down that route tomorrow. So he will want more of the same, no two ways about it. And that, for me, so far, early though it is the biggest thing I've seen different in a Dean Smith Norwich side as opposed to a Daniel Farker one, because there's no way what we saw in the second half of Carrow Road last Saturday would have been something Daniel would have wanted his players to go and do. And that's maybe the difference in the respective coaching outlooks. But based on what we saw this season, I think, and it still may prove beyond this group of players for reasons already stated, but I think they'll be a lot closer to being what's required at Premier League level if they go down the Dean Smith route in terms of what they do without the ball as much as what they do with it, which is ultimately, why they've had to make this change. Because I don't think, even the Brentford game, let's be honest, anybody who was there, anybody who watched the highlights, that was very much backs against the wall, bodies on the line, against the Brentford team who've probably fallen off the levels they'd attained in that first month or so of the season, 6 weeks. But by no means was that a controlled performance in that second half at Brentford. They were hanging on a little bit, really, ultimately. And if that was to continue as it had done for a large part of the first part of this Premier League campaign, then I think we all probably know that the outcome was fairly inevitable. So something had to change in terms of Norwich's style and approach. And it's not just about get Cantwell in, get Billy Gilmore in. It needs to be within a template or a framework that means they're far more robust than they had been hitherto under Daniel. And as I say, we have to keep caveating it. Really, it wasn't even 90 minutes under Dean Smith. It was that second 45. So that's a very small sample. But if that's more of the type of team Dean Smith wants to put on the pitch and the approach he wants, then I think that bodes well. That really does bode well, because you would think Norwich are going to be in a lot more of the games than they were under Daniel. And then obviously it comes down to individual quality.
Yeah, I mean, for those who haven't checked out Terrace Talk yet, which is on our YouTube channel, we had Liam Keane, who reports on Wolves for the Express and Star. He spoke about maybe the changes that Bruno Lage has made compared to Nuno in terms of making them a bit more possession-based, and how when teams have pressed them high and early and quickly, when they've attempted to play sort of out from the back and play forward, that maybe they've struggled a little bit more. So that would certainly lend into maybe what Dean Smith spoke about today in terms of those players actually pressing in a real structure, which is maybe we haven't something we haven't seen from a Norwich City side under Daniel Farke. Let's wrap up with some questions then. We'll start with Luke, who I'm guessing is from up north, because he started with A up, lads. Ari Stuart Webber, if he knows it's not going to be football, he must have his sights set on something. We were talking about this earlier, Pad, between ourselves. He's a big F1 fan. We know that.
That's an understatement, Colin.
Yes, he's obviously been to visit. Is it Red Bull who have Christian Horner? My knowledge of F1 is relatively limited before, so that seems like the obvious route, doesn't it? That seems like maybe the step that he would want to take next in his career. In terms of what he would do in that setting and in that sport, I guess would remain up for debate, I suppose. I don't know if you're more of an F1 fan than I am.
No. You talked to the two wrong people for this, my friend. But purely and simply on what he said last night, my next job won't be in football. So I would imagine I just couldn't see him completely coming out of a sporting environment, because his working life has been sport/football. So, given his passion for F1, it does seem to lead. But what role and he would go into in a if it was an F1 team, fascinating. And I'm sure there must be examples, but I mean, you quoted the one of the ex-Juventus administrator had gone into F1, so he's not completely a trailblazer. But if that's where he sees his future lying, then very fascinating.
Yeah, I think I'm just searching it now. I think he went from F1 into football. I think the Juve guy, but I might be completely wrong. So not completely unheard of. And I guess in terms of a sporting director role, which is long-term planning, which is implementing a culture, which is we know he speaks a lot about high performance, for example, those kind of buzzwords. That is a lot of what F1 looks to do, doesn't it? Technically, so. I suppose it's a bit watch this space, but that is as close as we've come in terms of him talking about his future and maybe it lying outside of football. I can't find it now, but I'm pretty sure that is right. Liam Winnell has said slightly disappointed to hear that right as of now that investment they aren't looking at, essentially, which is again another snippet of last night. Anthony Richards, finance director, said they've received quite a few inquiries. A lot of those, as you can imagine, aren't genuine. They have to go through a vetting process that then gets pushed to Delia and Michael for the credible ones, but very much a different line in terms of they're not looking or kind of searching for investment right now. But I guess it's not really changed in the sense that if something did arise and it was in the best interest of the football club, then they would consider it, which is obviously something that the owners have maintained in the last few years. Amanda says it's our time to beat Wolves tomorrow. I certainly hope so. I was looking earlier on. I think in the last 4 games, 4 meetings between these sides, Norwich are yet to win or haven't won. So that doesn't bode particularly well. That's right. In the last 4, 3 defeats and 1 draw. Of course, 2 of those games in the Premier League last time around. It was one of those games in December in 2019 where Norwich were pretty good for the first half, had a 1-0 lead, and then let it.
Dare I mention his name? I think Buendia was unbelievable that day, wasn't he? But my abiding memory is the Molineux return, where I think it was on a Sunday off the top of my head, and Norwich were diabolical.
3-0,
yeah, they were diabolical that day. Really, really looked like a team at the end of the road. Long overdue.
Yeah, absolutely. Elliot Pearson has said, "What's your lineups for Saturday?" I'll tweet this a little bit, Pad, I'll come to you in terms. I mean, again, we'll discuss this a little bit more when we go live tomorrow ahead of the team news about 10 to 2 on all of our channels. You can watch it. What changes, if any, would you make if you were in Dean Smith's position going into tomorrow? I guess the key debate is around Cantwell. Interestingly, you asked him about centre backs as well, so maybe you can feed a little bit of his response about that as well.
Yeah, well, it was on the centre backs. It was mainly just to clarify that Ozan Kabak, who wasn't in the matchday squad last weekend, having had a glandular fever, that there was no issues there in terms of his health, and it wasn't really. Although Dean Smith did say that he'd only probably trained 2 or 3 sessions towards the end of that week, so hence why he didn't get in. But he said he was quite unfortunate not to make the matchday squad. Of course, he knows all about Andrew Omobamidele, and he said, yeah, very unlucky probably to come out of the team on the back of his Brentford display. But he actually wanted, he said 2 things. He wanted the experience of Hanley and Gibson against Southampton, first day for him in the job. So why wouldn't you want that? He talked prior to that game about leaders and getting the leaders on side. But also he wanted the right left-footed balance as well in his team that Gibson provides. So I think it's their shirt for the foreseeable. But as Dean Smith said today, they know that they can't drop their levels because in Kabak and Omobamidele, there's 2 very, very good options. And of course, Zimbo at some point might be back in the mix once he recovers from his ankle surgery. But no, in terms of the 11 tomorrow, I think I've probably talked around it. I can only see one debate, really. If all the other 10 players who finished that game on Saturday last are fit, as Dean Smith said they were this morning, then it's either Sargent or Cantwell for me. And I don't know, I'm probably just leaning towards more Sargent, given that now we've sort of learned a little bit about how Wolves will set about it and that they will try and dictate. So if it's a team who might want to try and do what Southampton did, then do you go more for the urgency and the aggressiveness of a Sargent, at least for the first half, and then of course Cantwell, what a great option to decide a game off the bench if we get to the 60-minute mark and the game's in the balance. Yeah, famous last words, but I can see probably the 11 who finished last Saturday starting tomorrow. But as you say, Connor, we'll find out about an hour before. What's your thoughts on the 11?
Yeah, I also think that he'll probably start with the team that ended the game. Just from what he said about standards and how that's probably set the tone a little bit for what he expects as well, and the style of football that he wants to play, which is, as we've spoken about in the last half an hour or so, is a lot more based around the press and maybe Norwich City's work off the ball. It's interesting to say that on Tuesday they spent essentially a whole session working on transitions, but obviously attacking and defensive. So again, that's work off the ball. That would lead me to think we're probably looking at Josh Sargent getting a run out and maybe Todd Cantwell dropping to the bench. I mean, he did describe it as a risk last week, didn't he? So I suppose whether he takes that one, maybe it will have a reverse effect, and maybe we'll see Josh Sargent taking off after 60 minutes, and then Todd Cantwell really flourish in the final half an hour or so against tiring defenders. Maybe that will be the outlook. But beyond that, I can't see too many changes, to be honest, because as you said, the second half performance was probably a lot closer to what he would like. We'll end with Ben's question, because obviously Stuart Webber said yesterday again at the AGM to expect a quiet January. Essentially, we had some links this morning to a Hull City centre-back, Jacob Greaves, who is 21, very highly rated by all accounts, very modern centre-back. I think he impressed on loan at Cheltenham as well at some stage of his career. So that's an interesting one. Smith kind of sort of knocked it back when he was asked about it this morning. But on the kind of outgoing front, Ben has asked if Norwich were to buy a striker in January or get one in on loan maybe, would that ultimately mean a loan move for Ida? It's again interesting, isn't it, that we've had a second head coach come in who has looked immediately towards Teemu Pukki, which any coach would, I would imagine, walking into Norwich City, but then also has given Josh Sargent a chance rather than Adam Ida. We've spoken about him a lot, and maybe the frustrating situation that he finds himself in, where he's probably still in that halfway house between probably being very, very much too good for the 23s, but not quite good enough to displace Teemu Pukki. And as a result, time is passing him by and he's not really getting much appearances on the pitch. So could you see a loan move in January for Adam Ida?
I can't see it purely in terms of the numbers. Obviously, Hugo's out of the equation. One or two younger development players, can't really factor them in. So in terms of pure numbers, because what if, heaven forbid, you get an injury as it happened 2 seasons ago, Teemu Pukki, and isn't quite the same player again in the second half of the Premier League season. Sargent completely unproven at this level as a goal scorer. You could argue harshly, maybe, but true on the numbers, unproven as a goal scorer in his career so far. So I don't see either being allowed out if the numbers stay as the same, stay as they are. The only way that changes is if they go and do something in January. But taking Stuart at his most recent public appearance last night, they'd have to sell to buy. And Dean Smith, when January was put to him earlier today, very clear to shut that down and say, I need to more or less get to know these players and work with these players over the next month or so before the window opens. So, you'd probably have to say maybe the jury's out in terms of Dean Smith and what he thinks about Adam Eder, because he hasn't probably seen enough of him to date. But things can change very quickly. He can get an opportunity off the bench in one of these next games in the next month or so and really lay down a marker. And if so, then Dean Smith will want to keep him in the building. But separating all those elements out purely in terms of the lad, as the question sort of alludes to, he is now at a stage where he does need to play football. And if it's not going to be Norwich in the Premier League, then maybe a Championship style loan. And if it isn't to be January because of the logistics around that and what Norwich need in terms of their squad depth, then, and he doesn't get any real game time between now and May, then it's inevitable. He would have to go out and get football next season because his career is starting to pass him by. And I know he's a very, very young man, and they think a huge amount of him, as they do at Republic of Ireland level. Stephen Kenny has brought him straight into the senior setup. So there's a player there, no doubt about it, but a player who needs to be playing games to actually kick on now and fulfill some of that potential we all think he's got. And if it's not to be Norwich, I think, if the situation stays as it is and we get to next summer, although the only caveat with that, of course, is, Timu's another year older, they're possibly back in the Championship. Do you then almost unleash Adam Eder in the Championship? But I still think they'd probably want a more polished operator if it was to be the Championship next season. So, I think it's probably leading to a loan posting, but whether it's January or whether it's the summer, time will tell.
Yeah, we shall see. Thank you all very much for joining us. I'm going to leave you with this review, which I'm going to call it a review that made me chuckle, from Mr. Radio Floyd on YouTube. He said he's managed to sew up his jeans during this, which I'm not sure if that's a compliment to us or not. But
probably not. No.
Thank you very much for listening. Thank you all very much for watching as well. Pinken.com, of course, the place to go as we continue to build up to tomorrow's game. Will be at Carrow Road. Analysis, reaction, live updates will all be on the website as well. Of course, our YouTube channel and podcasts all available as well. Pad, thank you very much. Thank you all very much, and we'll see you again.